Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan. September 1985. The dust of a recent ambush hangs in the thin, cold air. A Spetsnaz GRU OSNAZ team moves with practiced lethality through the debris of a destroyed Mujahideen supply column. Their commander, a starshiner with eyes the color of slate, kneels beside a splintered crate. Inside, amidst Czech-made ammunition and Chinese medical packs, lies an object that does not belong. It is a mangled piece of blackened metal, a trigger assembly group, but its design is unfamiliar. The machining is precise, the alloy lightweight. It is not Soviet, not Eastern Bloc. Nearby, a young scout studies the ground. He points to a boot print pressed into a patch of soft earth near a dominating ridgeline, a perfect overwatch position the Mujahideen had used. The print is deep from a crouch. The tread pattern is intricate, aggressive, a Vibram sole. Not the simple worn pattern of a Dushman's Pakistani-made boot. These are the ghosts left behind by the stories whispered in the Soldatsky circles, the foreign instructors, the advisors, the ones who did not just supply stingers and mines, but who taught a new, sharpened language of war. The starshiner turns the strange metal component in his hand. His team is the spear point of the Red Army, masters of deep reconnaissance, sabotage, and brutal, direct action. Yet here in this silent valley, they are forensic detectives confronted with a puzzle. This was not the work of illiterate mountain fighters. This was methodology, a signature. It spoke of a calm, technological patience utterly alien to the brutal, overwhelming violence that was the Soviet way. A quiet revelation settled over the site. They were not just fighting an insurgency. They were confronting the shadow of a rival, a doctrine, and a technology they were only beginning to understand. This encounter, repeated in subtle variations across the Afghan theatre, would begin to forge a troubling awareness within the Soviet special operations community, a baffled recognition of the widening gap between their own formidable capabilities and the emerging art of war being perfected by the West, an art whose most potent symbol would become the United States' enigmatic Delta Force. To understand the Soviet Spetsnaz's growing sense of tactical dissonance in the mountains of Afghanistan, one must first step back to the geopolitical earthquake that precipitated their deployment. The year is 1978. In Kabul, a violent communist coup, the Tsar Revolution, overthrows the government of Mohammad Daoud Khan. The New People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan (PDPA) regime, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki, immediately launches a brutal campaign of Soviet-style modernization. Land reforms threaten traditional power structures. Secularization attacks Islamic orthodoxy. Resistance ignites almost instantly, spreading from rural valleys to city streets. By early 1979, the PDPA is fracturing internally, while the Mujahideen rebellion gains ferocious momentum. The Soviet Politburo watches with deepening alarm. Their client state is unraveling. In March, the city of Herat rises in revolt. Afghan army units mutiny and massacre Soviet advisors and their families. The message is clear: the revolution will collapse. On December 24, 1979, the Politburo's decision, long debated and fraught with hesitation, is enacted. Operation Storm 333 commences. KGB, Zenit and Grom groups, alongside Spetsnaz from the Muslim Battalion, assault the Tajbeg Palace, killing President Hafizullah Amin. The following day, Soviet ground forces begin pouring across the Amu Darya river bridges. The 40th Army is now committed to a war the Soviet leadership believes will be short, decisive and stabilizing. Their initial military doctrine is a direct transplant from the European theatre. Large motorized rifle columns securing key population centres and highways, backed by overwhelming artillery and aerial firepower. It is a doctrine of occupation and overwhelming force designed to shatter a conventional enemy. But the Mujahideen are not a conventional enemy. They are a fluid, decentralized network of lashkars, fighting groups, organized by regional and religious leaders like Ahmed Shah Massoud in the Panjshir and Jalaluddin Haqqani in Paktia. They melt into the population and the impossible geography of the Hindu Kush. By 1980, it is evident the war is a stalemate. The Mujahideen cannot defeat the 40th Army in open battle. The 40th Army cannot eliminate an insurgency that has no central base to destroy. It is into this brutalizing conflict that the Soviet Union's premier special forces, the Spetsnaz GRU, are thrust. Their mission set evolves rapidly: deep penetration reconnaissance to find enemy bases, interdiction of supply caravans along the infiltration routes from Pakistan and Iran, and direct action raids against key commanders. They are the scalpel to the army's blunt hammer. Simultaneously, on the other side of the world, a different kind of military evolution was taking place. The United States, humiliated by the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, the disastrous 1980 attempt to rescue hostages in Tehran, was undergoing a painful, radical transformation of its own special operations capabilities. Special Operations Command and, most significantly for this story, the full maturation of the Army's first Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force. Created by Colonel Charles Beckwith in 1977 based on his experiences with the British SAS, Delta was designed explicitly for counter-terrorism and hostage rescue. Missions requiring surgical precision, split-second decision-making, and autonomous small-unit action. While the Spetsnaz trained to destroy bridges, headquarters, and missile sites behind NATO lines in a general war, Delta trained to clear rooms, negotiate hijackings, and shoot with pinpoint accuracy under extreme psychological pressure. Their proving ground would not be a World War III battlefield, but the burgeoning global theatre of terrorism. These two parallel evolutionary paths, the Soviet Spetsnaz, masters of strategic sabotage, and the American Delta Force, architects of tactical counter-terrorism, were on a collision course. The battlefield would be Afghanistan, but the confrontation would be indirect, a clash of proxies and principles. The vector for this clash was the CIA's Covert Action Program, initiated by President Jimmy Carter in July 1979 and massively expanded under President Ronald Reagan. This program, funneled through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), did not just provide weapons, it became a conduit for knowledge. The CIA's covert pipeline, codenamed Operation Cyclone, began as a trickle of non-attributable weapons and funds. By the mid-1980s, it had become a torrent. The Mujahideen's arsenal evolved from antiquated British Lee Enfields and Soviet weapons captured from the DRA to a standardized suite of tools optimized for guerrilla warfare. Chinese Type 56 assault rifles, Egyptian RPG-7s, and most devastatingly, the American-supplied FM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense system. But alongside this hardware flowed something less tangible yet more transformative, sophisticated military training. While initial instruction was handled by the Pakistani ISI at camps near the border, the demand for advanced specialized skills grew. The Mujahideen were brilliant natural light infantry, but they lacked expertise in complex sabotage, coordinated ambushes beyond the tribal level, long-range marksmanship, and the use of cutting-edge technology. To fill this gap, a small, deniable cadre of Western advisors began to appear. Army Green Berets conducting official foreign internal defense missions. UK and other NATO nations, private contractors and intelligence officers operating under deep cover. Their mission was to act as force multipliers, transforming talented but irregular fighters into a more professional, lethal insurgency. It was in this advisory role that the doctrinal fingerprints of units like Delta Force and the British SAS began to appear in the Afghan theatre. The lessons they imparted were not from conventional field manuals, but from the emerging playbook of modern counter-terrorism and special operations. They taught methods of close-quarter battle, CQB, that emphasized speed, surprise, and violence of action. They instructed on the meticulous construction of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, using timers, pressure plates, and remote detonation, techniques honed in the laboratories of terror and counter-terror. They schooled select mujahideen in the art of long-range precision sniping, moving beyond the Kochaki marksmanship of the hills to understanding windage, ballistics, and stealth. For the Soviet soldier, and particularly for the observant Spetsnaz operator, the effects of this tutelage became increasingly evident on the battlefield. Ambushes grew more sophisticated. Instead of a frenzied, massed attack from a single hillside, they faced coordinated, multi-point engagements with killing zones meticulously overlapped by interlocking fields of fire, a classic SAS staple. IEDs became more cunning and deadly, moving from simple command-wired mines to devices that targeted the specific vulnerabilities of Soviet convoy procedures. Most tellingly, the Mujahideen began to demonstrate an unnerving ability to engage high-value targets. Senior DRA officials, skilled Soviet helicopter pilots, and even Spetsnaz commanders themselves, with a precision that suggested intelligence-driven targeting and expert marksmanship. The Soviet military and intelligence apparatus slowly pieced together this puzzle. Captured mujahideen under interrogation spoke of quiet, professional men who did not give orders, but asked questions and demonstrated techniques. They described training camps where the focus was not on mass assaults, but on small, independent teams performing specific, complex tasks. The Spetsnaz, the Soviet Union's own elite, found themselves in a paradoxical position. They were the hunters, the apex predators of the Soviet war machine. Yet they were now stalking a prey that was being taught how to hunt them by a phantom rival whose own playbook was a mystery. The war was no longer just against the mujahideen, it was a laboratory, and the Spetsnaz were unwitting test subjects in a live-fire experiment comparing two diametrically opposed philosophies of special warfare. This sets the stage for a deeper examination of the specific angles of this unseen conflict: the human experience, the tactical innovations, the technological gap, and the profound doctrinal chasm that left the formidable Spetsnaz both baffled and dangerously behind. The Soviet Spetsnaz soldier in Afghanistan was a product of a specific, brutal ecosystem. Recruited from the most physically and mentally resilient conscripts, he underwent a training regime that emphasized endurance, weapons proficiency, and unwavering loyalty to the mission. His identity was subsumed by the collective. Initiative was encouraged, but only within the rigid framework of a top-down command structure. He was taught to operate behind enemy lines for weeks, to survive on minimal resources, and to inflict maximum damage on infrastructure and key personnel. His psychological profile was that of a hardened, resourceful, and often fatalistic warrior, comfortable with extreme violence as a tool of state policy. Confronting the output of Western advisory efforts forced a profound cognitive shift. The Spetsnaz did not face the Western advisor directly on the battlefield. Such a confrontation was the stuff of intelligence fantasy. Instead, they encountered his students, and through them they perceived the ghostly outline of his methods. In prisoner interrogations, a recurring theme emerged. Captured mujahideen from certain elite groups spoke not of ideological fervor alone, but of technical processes. They could describe with unsettling clarity the step-by-step assembly of a complex electronic detonator, the mathematical calculations for a shaped charge, or the systematic method for reconnoitering a Soviet airbase's perimeter. This was not the passionate, often chaotic recounting of a tribal fighter. It was the calm recitation of a technician. For the Spetsnaz interrogator, this was disorienting. Their own training was visceral, rooted in physical mastery and fieldcraft. The enemy they now faced had been taught to think like an engineer, like a surgeon. The human element was further highlighted in the aftermath of engagements. 62 Bardos 51mm NATO rounds, ammunition the mujahideen did not standardly use, suggesting a spotter or advisor firing his own weapon. These subtle clues painted a portrait of an adversary who was not just courageous, but coolly professional. The psychological warfare was profound. The Spetsnaz knew how to break a fanatic. But how does one intimidate a student of applied physics? How does one predict the movements of a fighter who bases his actions not on tribal honor or immediate opportunity, but on a methodical, intelligence-fed, targeting cycle taught by a phantom? The very anonymity of the Western advisor became a weapon. He was a spectre of superior knowledge, a constant suggestion that for all their formidable skills, the Spetsnaz were applying a 20th century industrial warfare mindset to a new asymmetrical science of war whose textbook was being written by their unseen rivals. The tactical chasm between Soviet Spetsnaz practices and the emerging Western doctrine was perhaps the most immediately baffling and lethal aspect of the confrontation. Soviet special operations tactics, even at their most refined, were an extension of deep battle theory. A classic Spetsnaz ambush, for instance, was an act of overwhelming, concentrated violence. It involved sealing a kill zone with heavy weapons, PKM machine guns, AGS-17 automatic grenade launchers, and RPGs, and then annihilating everything within it. The goal was destruction of the enemy force and material. Efficiency was measured in volume of fire and completeness of the kill. It was a brutal, undeniable statement of power. Conversely, the tactics filtering to the mujahideen through Western advisors, drawing from the counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency playbook, emphasized discrimination, precision, and psychological effect. The ambushes became surgical. Instead of one large kill zone, a Soviet convoy might be hit by a precisely timed IED that disabled the lead vehicle, followed immediately by focused, aimed sniper fire targeting officers and radio operators in the command BTR. The rest of the convoy might be left largely untouched but paralyzed, pinned down by a few well-placed semi-automatic marksmen, while the main Mujahideen force remained concealed. The goal was not total annihilation, but mission kill, disrupt the Soviet operation, inflict disproportionate casualties on leadership and specialists, and withdraw without decisive engagement. It was a tactic of erosion, not obliteration. This precision was alien to the Soviet experience. Their own CQB techniques used in palace assaults like Storm 333 relied on speed, mass, and suppressive fire, the avalanche method. The Western-derived room-clearing techniques taught to Mujahideen saboteurs for attacking isolated outposts or headquarters emphasized slicing the pie, controlled pairs, and immediate threat discrimination, skills born from hostage rescue scenarios where friend and foe were intermingled. For the Spetsnaz, clearing a building meant saturating it with grenades and automatic fire. The Western method was a silent, methodical chess game. When the Spetsnaz saw evidence of a small team entering a DRA district office, killing 3 specific officials and exfiltrating without a general massacre or setting the building ablaze, they recognized a different calculus at work. It was not terror, it was targeted removal. This shift from area saturation to point targeting represented a fundamental evolution in special warfare, one that the Spetsnaz, for all their courage and skill, were not institutionally designed to emulate or easily counter. They were masters of the sledgehammer. They were now facing a foe being taught to use a scalpel. The Soviet soldier, and the Spetsnaz in particular, marched to war with the mechanical progeny of the Great Patriotic War's design philosophy, weapons and equipment that were robust, simple to operate, easy to mass produce, and tolerant of neglect. The AK-74, the RPK, the RPG-7, these were icons of utilitarian reliability. A Spetsnaz soldier's individual kit was functional, but often no more advanced than that of a regular motor rifleman. Their technological edge lay in heavier support weapons and, critically, in overwhelming vehicular and aerial support from the wider 40th Army. They fought as part of a technologically integrated system, but the individual operator's gear was deliberately low-tech. The technology introduced or emphasized by Western advisors, however, was of a different order. It was focused on amplifying the capabilities of the individual fighter or small team within an asymmetric context. This was not about matching Soviet firepower, but about bypassing it with intelligence and precision. The most iconic example is the man-portable, disposable, ruggedized advanced pathfinder Arapia satellite communications terminal, precursors to which began appearing. This allowed a Mujahideen commander like Massoud to coordinate disparate groups across valleys without relying on compromised radio signals, a leap in C3I, command, control, communications, and intelligence, that Soviet signals intelligence struggled to intercept or jam. In the field of optics and marksmanship, the gap was stark. The Soviet standard-issue PSO-1 scope on the SVD Dragunov was a capable 4X optic designed for designating targets for squads. In contrast, Western advisors introduced high-magnification commercial hunting scopes, loopholed Zeiss, and taught the art of true long-range precision shooting. A Mujahideen sniper trained to understand minute of angle and doping the wind could now engage targets at 800 meters and beyond with a consistency that Soviet forces, relying on volume fire, found both deadly and demoralizing. The weapons themselves were often accurized civilian rifles or early iterations of what would become the precision rifle platform. Perhaps most telling was the approach to explosives. Soviet demolition training was formulaic. Use a standard charge of this size to destroy a target of that type. The Western-inspired IEDs became forms of bespoke artistry. They utilized modern plastic explosives like C4, with non-electric initiation systems, radio-controlled detonation from high ground, and sophisticated pressure-release switches that targeted the second vehicle in a column, the one carrying the reacting troops. For Spetsnaz engineers examining a blast crater, the forensic evidence spoke of a knowledge of shaped charge effects and wave propagation that went far beyond basic sabotage. This technological disparity was not about whose rifle was better, it was about whose methodology leveraged technology to create strategic effects from tactical actions. The Spetsnaz had technology that served their doctrine of destruction. Their phantom rivals were providing technology that enabled a new doctrine of strategic paralysis. The Soviet military machine, for all its elite Spetsnaz units, operated on a principle of centralized control. The Spetsnaz team in the field, while granted more autonomy than line units, was still an instrument of a distant command. Missions were planned in detail by GRU staff officers based on intelligence from above. A political officer, Zampolit, was often attached to ensure ideological compliance. Initiative was expected, but within strict parameters. The model was that of the perfectly tuned component in a vast hierarchical machine. Success was measured in the execution of the assigned plan. The Western Special Operations model, particularly the Delta Force template, was built on the opposite principle: decentralized execution. It relied on mission-type orders. Commanders would define the objective and the intent, but the how was left to the team on the ground. This required a profound investment in training every operator to the level of a strategic thinker and empowering non-commissioned officers to make critical decisions in real time. It was a philosophy born of counter-terrorism, where scenarios were fluid, intelligence was perishable, and milliseconds mattered. This philosophical chasm manifested clearly in the advisory efforts. Western instructors didn't just teach mujahideen how to perform a task, they taught them how to decide which task to perform. They emphasized intelligence preparation of the battlefield, IPB, pattern analysis of Soviet patrols, and the selection of targets based on systemic vulnerability rather than opportunistic chance. They trained small cells to operate independently for extended periods, making their own decisions about engagement and withdrawal based on a shared understanding of the broader mission intent. This created a resilient, adaptive network, not a rigid hierarchy. For the Spetsnaz and their GRU handlers, this adaptive quality made the enemy frustratingly unpredictable. A standard Soviet operation might involve sweeping a valley to clear it of mujahideen. The traditional response was for the guerrillas to fade away or mass for a counterattack. Now they might do neither. Instead, a single autonomous team operating on a mission-type order to degrade Soviet air power might infiltrate a distant, undefended fuel depot and destroy it, while the main force remained hidden. The tactical action had a strategic effect, but it bore no relation to the immediate Soviet operation. The Spetsnaz, trained to find and fix an enemy force, were chasing ghosts who answered not to an immediate commander in the next valley, but to a strategic objective in their own minds. They were facing a command and control model that was more organic, more resilient, and in the context of an insurgency, more advanced than their own. The very structure of their enemy's decision-making process had become a weapon against which their traditional military science was poorly equipped. This multifaceted dissonance, human, tactical, technological, and doctrinal, was coalescing into a recognizable pattern for the Soviet Special Operations community. The realization was dawning that they were in a competition they had not prepared for. The climax of this realization would not be a single battle, but a series of jarring encounters and forensic revelations that would force a reluctant, institutional acknowledgement. The turning point was not a thunderous battle with clear front lines, but a creeping forensic realization that solidified in the minds of Soviet commanders and intelligence analysts between 1986 and 1987. It was a collage of disparate, jarring incidents that, when pieced together by the GRU's analytical desks, formed an inescapable and alarming mosaic. The war was being methodologically upgraded in real time, and the Spetsnaz were being out-evolved in their own domain. The first hard evidence came from the sky, and from the ground it left scarred. The introduction of the Stinger missile in the fall of 1986 is well documented as a strategic game-changer for its catastrophic impact on Soviet air mobility. But for the Spetsnaz and GRU analysts, the Stinger's deployment was also a masterclass in the new doctrine they faced. The missiles were not handed out indiscriminately. They were allocated to specific, vetted teams who underwent intensive training programs. These programs, as gleaned from prisoner interrogations and signal intercepts, were not just about pointing and shooting. They covered advanced camouflage, hide site construction, thermal signature reduction, and complex fire discipline, training a single team to wait for days to engage the highest value target, a Hind or a Mi-24 gunship, while letting lower value transports pass. This was not the behavior of a traditional guerrilla force. It was the behavior of a military unit conducting a deliberate air defense ambush, a concept of operations, conceptia operatii, that was strikingly professional and patient. The Spetsnaz, often tasked with hunting these stinger teams, found themselves hunting shadows who operated with a counter-sniper's mentality. On the ground, a series of targeted assassinations and raids on high-security facilities delivered more tangible proof. One pivotal incident was the 1987 attack on the Soviet airbase at Bagram. Beyond the usual perimeter rocket attacks, a small, skilled team infiltrated the heavily guarded inner perimeter and successfully sabotaged several aircraft in their hardened revetments. The method of entry, the bypassing of sensor fields, and the precise placement of charges on fuel lines and avionics bays spoke of a level of technical reconnaissance and covert breach capability that stunned the KGB's 9th Directorate, responsible for security. The subsequent investigation concluded the attack required detailed, insider-quality knowledge of the base layout and guard rotations. Intelligence that could only have been gathered through sustained professional surveillance, a hallmark of Special Operations Preparatory Surveillance (OPs), not casual guerrilla reconnaissance. Perhaps the most psychologically impactful events were the targeted killings of Spetsnaz and VDV, airborne commanders. These were not deaths in the heat of a chaotic battle. In several documented cases in Kunar and Nangarhar provinces, company and platoon leaders were struck by a single high-velocity rifle shot from extreme range during the planning phase of an operation, often while they were visibly inspecting maps or terrain through binoculars. 51mm NATO. The kill shots, delivered from distances exceeding 800 meters, indicated the work of a trained sniper team, a shooter and a spotter with a laser rangefinder or advanced scope. The message was unmistakable and personal. The Soviet elite were themselves being deliberately hunted by an enemy who could see them, understand their value, and remove them with clinical detachment. This inversion of the hunter-hunted dynamic was a profound shock to the Spetsnaz psyche. They were the ones who were supposed to decapitate the enemy's leadership. Now their own heads were in the crosshairs of a phantom who understood their tactics all too well. The evidence was mounting, moving from suspicion to cold, hard fact. The final pieces of the puzzle would come from direct physical capture and from the highest levels of Soviet military intelligence, forcing an institutional admission they were reluctant to make. The theoretical became incontrovertibly material in the form of captured hardware. During a major cordon and search operation in the Logar province in early 1988, a Spetsnaz otriad overran a well-concealed Mujahideen field headquarters that had been hastily evacuated. Among the discarded gear were not just maps and radio codes, but technical manuals. They were in English. Detailed laminated quick reference cards for the M18A1 Claymore mine, with firing assemblies far more sophisticated than the simple M150 Soviet equivalent. S-Army field manuals on reconnaissance and surveillance, annotated in both English and Pashto. Most tellingly, the team recovered several shattered pieces of a AN/PRC-1117 satellite communications transceiver, a piece of technology so advanced it was virtually unknown to Soviet signals intelligence at the tactical level. This was not captured from a regular army. This was the toolkit of a force being professionally educated. Simultaneously, the KGB's first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, and the GRU were piecing together human intelligence from their networks in Pakistan and the Middle East. Their reporting converged on a specific, alarming conclusion. The quality of training being provided to the Mujahideen had undergone a quantum leap. It was no longer just basic weapons instruction. The instructors were described as ex-military, often American or British, operating under commercial cover or through third-country cutouts. A single highly credible GRU report from their residentura in Islamabad, citing a source within the Pakistani military, summarized the revelation with chilling clarity. The most effective opposition groups are no longer fighting as Afghan tribesmen. They are fighting as integrated company-sized special forces units, utilizing Western small unit tactics and technology. This intelligence filtered up to the senior echelons of the Soviet General Staff and the KGB. The institutional response was a mixture of denial, frustration, and reluctant analysis. Within the closed studies of the GRU's headquarters in Moscow, comparative assessments began. S-Delta Force training at Fort Bragg, The correlations were disturbing. The multi-phase ambushes, the emphasis on precision sniping, the use of delayed and remote IEDs to shape the battlefield and isolate command elements, these were not random innovations. They were the adapted signatures of a counter-terrorist and special warfare doctrine designed for surgical, high-stakes operations in politically complex environments. For the Spetsnaz commanders in Afghanistan, this analytical confirmation validated their lived experience in the field. The turning point was this moment of collective institutional recognition. The correlation of forces, a sacred Soviet military concept measuring tangible military power, was failing to deliver victory. They possessed overwhelming force, armor, and air power, yet they were being systematically outthought and outfought at the tactical and operational level by an insurgency that was being mentored into a proxy special operations force. The very concepts their Western rivals had developed to counter terrorism and wage clandestine war were now being used to bleed the Soviet military to a standstill. The realization was a profound professional insult and a strategic alarm bell. The Spetsnaz, the USSR's ultimate warriors, were confronting an enemy whose playbook was more modern, more flexible, and in the context of a grinding insurgency, more effective than their own. The climax was not a defeat in battle, but the defeat of a paradigm. The era of relying solely on mass brutality and deep sabotage was over. A new, more cerebral and technologically enabled form of special warfare had arrived on the battlefield, and the Soviets had been forced to bear witness to its devastating efficacy. This hard-won, painful knowledge would now begin to shape the final years of the Soviet war and set in motion a desperate and ultimately unfinished process of adaptation and reform. The immediate aftermath of this realization within the Soviet war effort was a period of frantic, often clumsy, adaptation. The Spetsnaz and the broader 40th Army Command understood they needed to close the gap, but they were attempting to do so within the rigid confines of a decaying military bureaucracy and a failing war. The responses were a mixture of technological mimicry, tactical adjustment, and intensified brutality, each revealing the limitations of their system. Technologically, the Soviet defense industry was tasked with rapid counter-developments. The encounter with Western precision optics and long-range shooting spurred the accelerated fielding of the VSS Vintorez sniper rifle and its companion AS-Val assault rifle. These integrated silent weapon systems, chambered in a heavy subsonic 9x39mm cartridge, were a direct response to the need for a dedicated, close-to-medium-range precision tool for Spetsnaz, ideal for the kind of quiet, targeted removals they were now facing. Similarly, efforts were made to improve personal equipment, with early experiments in body armor and better field uniforms. However, these were niche solutions for elite units. The broader army remained stuck with outdated gear, and the systemic issue, the lack of a comparable, small unit-level technological ecosystem encompassing communications, surveillance, and targeting, remained unaddressed. Tactically, Spetsnaz units attempted to incorporate lessons. There was a greater emphasis on counter-sniper operations and on deploying Spetsnaz in smaller, more agile groups to mirror the autonomy of their Mujahideen counterparts. They increased their own reconnaissance and surveillance efforts, trying to preempt the meticulous planning cycles of the adversary. Some units even experimented with modified camouflage and non-standard footwear in a bid to reduce their signature. Yet these adaptations were hamstrung by the overarching Soviet doctrine. A Spetsnaz team might be more agile, but it still required approval from a distant chain of command to initiate a complex operation. The ingrained culture of centralized control and the ever-present political oversight stifled the kind of decentralized decision-making that was the hallmark of their enemy's effectiveness. They could mimic the motions, but not the mindset. The most prevalent and tragic response was an escalation in indiscriminate violence. If the enemy was using precision to erode their will, the Soviet command often defaulted to overwhelming force to annihilate the will to resist entirely. The scorched earth tactics of the Panjshir offensives, the widespread use of aerial bombardment and Scud missiles against civilian areas suspected of supporting the guerrillas, and the brutal counterinsurgency methods of the KGB's KAD, Afghan secret police, allies, were all manifestations of this. It was the application of a sledgehammer where a scalpel was needed, and it served only to deepen the hatred of the population, fueling the very insurgency they sought to crush. This brutality was a tacit admission of tactical and technological failure, an attempt to solve a complex, asymmetric problem with the only tool they truly trusted: raw, destructive power. By 1988-89, as the Politburo under Gorbachev sought a face-saving exit through the Geneva Accords, the Spetsnaz were often used as the rear guard, covering the withdrawal of the 40th Army. In these final operations, the asymmetry was painfully clear. They were not conducting graceful precision raids. They were fighting desperate holding actions against an enemy that now moved with a confidence and skill they had helped, however inadvertently, to forge. The war ended not with a decisive military defeat for the Spetsnaz on the ground, but with a profound professional and institutional humiliation. They had been outfought at their own game by a ghost. The return to the Soviet Union was not a triumph, but a retreat into an empire already unraveling, carrying with them the bitter lessons of a war that had exposed the fatal rigidities of their system. The true, enduring aftermath of the Soviet encounter with Western Special Operations Doctrine played out not in the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the corridors of power and training grounds of a dying and then reborn Russia. The war ended in 1989, but the forensic analysis of its failures had only begun. Within the GRU and the KGB's elite departments, a quiet professional revolution was taking shape. The veterans of Afghanistan, the Afghansi, particularly from the Spetsnaz, carried back a stark verdict. Their training, equipment, and tactics were obsolete for the new era of low-intensity conflict and non-linear warfare. The first, most visible consequence was the transformation of Soviet and later Russian special forces units. The old distinction between KGB, Alpha, Vimpel, and GRU Spetsnaz began to blur in terms of mission sets. The KGB's Group A, Alpha, originally a dedicated counter-terrorism unit for domestic incidents, and Group V, Vimpel, trained for foreign covert operations, had watched the Afghan experience closely. Post-1991, as Russia descended into chaos and faced its own separatist insurgencies, these units, now under the FSB, Federal Security Service, absorbed the hard lessons. They aggressively studied Western CT techniques. They adopted more flexible CQB doctrines, invested in advanced optics, communications, and surveillance technology purchased or reverse-engineered from the West, and emphasized the kind of mission command and NCO professionalism they had witnessed in their proxy foes. The Battle for Grozny, 1994 to 1995, was a catastrophic shock to the conventional Russian army, but for the surviving Spetsnaz and FSB Special Forces units involved, it was a brutal validation of the Afghan lessons. They performed better than line units precisely because they could operate in small, adaptive groups, a skill they had been forced to learn the hard way against the Mujahideen. The second consequence was doctrinal hybridization. The Russian military and security services did not simply copy Western models. They fused them with their own traditions of maskirovka, deception, deep battle theory, and a continued willingness to employ overwhelming, disproportionate force when needed. This created a unique, and often more brutal, hybrid special operations doctrine. It embraced the tactical autonomy and technological precision observed in the West, but wedded it to a strategic framework of psychological pressure, information warfare, and the ruthless targeting of civilian infrastructure to break an enemy's will, a strategy evident in the later wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. The Spetsnaz of the 2000s and 2010s were a product of this fusion. They could conduct a silent, nighttime reconnaissance using thermal imagers and GPS Western tech. Then call in a devastating artillery or airstrike on a coordinates traditional Soviet mass, and finally secure the area using aggressive small unit tactics, adapted Western CT coin. They had learned to be both scalpel and sledgehammer. Finally, the experience forged a deep, grudging respect and focused rivalry. The Phantom Delta Force advisor of the 1980s ceased to be a myth and became a known quantity, the benchmark. Russian special operations training curricula began to explicitly study NATO SOF tactics, techniques, and procedures. Exercises were designed to counter them. The professional literature within Russian special forces circles from the 1990s onward is replete with analytical references to Western methods, often dissecting them with a clarity born of painful, first-hand experience. This was not admiration in the traditional sense, but a cold, clinical recognition of a worthy adversary's effectiveness. It created a generation of Russian special operators who were, in many ways, mirror images of their Western counterparts, highly trained, technologically proficient, and ideologically committed, but operating within a fundamentally different political and ethical framework. The bafflement of the 1980s had crystallized into a permanent professional obsession. The unseen classroom of the Hindu Kush had, in the end, educated both sides, setting the stage for a decades-long shadow competition between special operations forces that would define countless clandestine battles in the post-Cold War world. This complex legacy of adaptation, hybridization, and enduring rivalry forms the final, sobering chapter of the story. It leads us from the confusion of an Afghan ambush site to the globalized high-stakes shadow wars of the 21st century. The silent war within the war in Afghanistan was ultimately a conflict of paradigms. On one side stood the Soviet Spetsnaz, the perfected instrument of a 20th century superpower. A military entity designed for symmetry, for the cleaving blow of deep battle against a peer enemy. On the other, the spectral influence of a nascent Western doctrine, born from the humiliation of desert failure and refined in the fires of counter-terrorism. It was a doctrine of asymmetry, of precision, of leveraging technology to grant the individual fighter strategic weight. The mountains and deserts of Afghanistan served as a brutal, impartial laboratory. Here, these two visions of special warfare were tested not in theory, but in the unforgiving calculus of survival and mission kill. The Soviet model, for all its fearsome potency, proved tragically rigid. It could seize ground, it could unleash terrifying violence, but it could not solve the riddle of an insurgency being guided by a more agile, intelligent principle. The evidence of this failure was written in the forensic details, in the machining of a captured trigger group, in the annotated pages of a foreign manual, in the extreme range of a single fatal shot. Yet this is not a simple tale of Western superiority. It is a story of adaptation, however painful. The Soviet and later Russian Special Forces community did what empires and militaries throughout history have done when confronted with a superior way of war. They learned, they stole, they adapted, and they hybridized. The legacy of their bafflement in the 1980s is etched into the very structure of modern Russian special operations, a fusion of observed Western precision with the enduring cultural propensity for strategic-level ruthlessness. In the end, the most profound outcome of this clandestine tutorial was the creation of a permanent dialogue in the language of special warfare. The Afghan Mujahideen were the medium, but the message was between two professional elites. The Spetsnaz, once baffled, became keen students. The unseen advisors, their methods validated in proxy, saw their own playbook adopted and adapted by their primary rival. This secret curriculum in the Hindu Kush did not end with the Soviet withdrawal. It set the terms for a new kind of great power competition, one fought not by massed armies at Fulda Gap, but by small, highly skilled teams in the grey zones of the world. It elevated special operations from a tactical tool to a strategic instrument. The ghost in the mountains had, in teaching one side how to fight, irrevocably changed both. The echo of those lessons learned in confusion and blood would resonate through the conflicts of the coming century, a lasting testament to the day the Soviets looked into the scope and saw not a fanatic's eye, but the cold, professional gaze of their future.